I'm Harper Langston, 30, and tonight was supposed to be a quiet evening at my parents' house just outside Seattle. After barely exchanging words with my father in over 2 years, I agreed mostly, for my mom's sake, to show up to what she called a casual family dinner. Only when I arrived in my slate blue blazer laptop bag in hand, it became immediately clear this wasn't just dinner. The driveway was packed with sleek sedans, the kind venture capital firms rent when they want to look local. I stepped inside, only to be met with my father's tight jaw and even tighter words. "Wait in the car." "Harper," he muttered, eyes darting past me toward the guests. "We're entertaining key investors. Tonight isn't the right time." The door clicked shut behind me before I could say a word. Had he known who I really was, he might have thought twice. But I'll get to that in a minute. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by your own family. So there, I was sitting on the hood of my old Subaru in the dark heels resting on the front bumper of my childhood home. Growing up, that house never truly felt like a home. My father, Gregory Langston, ran Langston Integrated Systems out of the converted den blueprints instead of puzzles, spreadsheets instead of board games. He built the company from scratch and made sure we knew it. Dinner tables were more like working lunches. Napkins gave way to sticky notes. My mom, Eleanor, floated around like a well-dressed afterthought, always smiling, always deflecting. "Your dad's just focused, sweetheart," she'd whisper while setting down a plate. "He's building a future for all of us." I stopped buying into that fantasy around the age of 11. My older brother Caleb, 4 years my senior, was the spitting image of Dad's stoic, brilliant, and fully indoctrinated. He was writing code by age 13 and beta testing it on me by 14. Dad adored him. This kid's going places, he'd beam, ignoring me entirely. But I wasn't some lost cause. I loved code too. I devoured Java manuals and Linux forums like other kids read comic books. Still, every time I tried to talk shop, Dad would chuckle. "Let Caleb handle the tech, Harper. Why don't you go help your mom with dessert?" When I was 15, I built my own custom rig from salvaged parts and saved allowance. Dad glanced at it, nodded vaguely, and handed me a glossy college brochure. "Fashion marketing. Might be more your lane, kiddo. This industry's brutal for women." That was the night I decided I didn't need his validation. Or his help. I pretended to major in English while secretly earning a dual degree in computer science and business from UW. I coded at night, interned all summer, hustled like my future depended on it because it did. At graduation, when I walked across the stage and the announcer said, "Bachelor of Science in Computer Science and Business Administration," Dad's face shifted from confusion to disappointment. He had no idea what was coming next. "You lied to us for 4 years. That was the first thing my father said after the graduation dinner that was supposed to celebrate me. His tone wasn't angry, it was worse. Disappointed and cold. "I didn't lie," I said evenly. "I just didn't correct your assumptions." Gregory scoffed. "And now? What you're going to spend the next decade clawing for recognition in a man's world when you could have walked in the front door here from the beginning?" But I'd already accepted a role at Blue Horizon Systems, one of his fiercest competitors in the Pacific Northwest tech scene. Not because I wanted to spite him, but because their forward-thinking innovation lit me up inside. They were building things that mattered, things that excited me. When I told him, he actually laughed. "They're hiring you as a diversity prop, Harper. You'll be fetching coffee in 6 months when they realize you're in over your head." My mother, Eleanor, gasped softly. My brother Caleb stared down at his half-eaten steak. And in that moment, something final and unspoken fractured between my father and me. "I guess we'll see," I replied, standing up and leaving my own graduation dinner behind. For the next 3 years, I kept communication minimal, occasional check-ins with my mom, the odd tech article texted to Caleb, and nothing more. I threw everything into my job at Blue Horizon. I started in product development, where I was given real autonomy and a seat at the table. I worked 80-hour weeks, stayed long after offices went dark, and poured every ounce of energy into designing intuitive cloud-based platforms. Each milestone came with sweat and sleepless nights. A year in, I was promoted to project manager, the next director of development. By the 3rd year, I became Vice President of Innovation, leading the charge into AI-integrated data systems. Every title validated what I had always known: I wasn't a fluke. I wasn't a charity hire. I belonged. Meanwhile, my mother kept me in the loop with filtered updates. Langston Integrated Systems wasn't doing well. My father had refused to modernize, doubling down on physical infrastructure, even as the industry pivoted hard toward cloud-based solutions. Caleb tried implementing updates, but Dad dismissed his suggestions the same way he once dismissed mine. Then last week, my phone buzzed. My mother's voice on the other end was gentle, but tinged with urgency. Your father's arranged a dinner. Potential investors. It's important, Harper. I stayed silent, scrolling through quarterly revenue charts on my second monitor. The company's barely hanging on. He's asking if you'll come. Just for optics. A united family front. Please for me. I should have asked more questions. Should have pressed about who these investors were. But I was buried in back-to-back strategy meetings. I hadn't even told them I'd just been appointed president of Blue Horizon Systems. I sighed. Fine. Text me the details. But I'm not pretending we're the Brady Bunch. Thank you, sweetheart, she said quietly. It means more than you know. If only I had known what I was walking into. And that's how I found myself driving toward my parents' house, for the first time in 3 years, an address I used to know by heart, but hadn't said out loud in a long while. The roads hadn't changed much, but everything else had. I wasn't here for reconciliation. I was here as a favor to my mother and unknowingly about to step into the most ironic business dinner of my career. When Gregory Langston waved me off at the door, the sting was immediate. A quick flick of his wrist like I was a gnat, buzzing too close to the suits in his precious dining room. I turned and walked back down the front steps of the house I once called home, heat crawling up my cheeks like fire. Through the bay window, I caught a glimpse of Eleanor arranging silverware on her best China six-place settings, perfectly spaced. She glanced toward me and paused, the look in her eyes both apologetic and helpless, before disappearing into the kitchen like she always did. Stephanie called earlier today, Eleanor had mentioned, as she pulled the roast from the oven. She asked how you were doing. Said her daughter might reach out about computer science. I stood in the driveway, car keys digging into my palm. Part of me, the teenage girl who once spent hours trying to decode her father's praise, wanted to obey. Just slide into the driver's seat and wait like a good daughter. But the other part, the woman who had just been named president of a multi-million-dollar tech firm, wanted to walk back in and ask how it felt to underestimate the wrong child. Unbelievable, I muttered, unlocking my Audi and sliding into the leather seat. He had no idea I'd taken time off during my first week as president of Blue Horizon Systems just to be here. That I'd carved out hours between acquisition reviews and board interviews to fulfill a hollow family obligation. And he couldn't even let me in the door. I sighed and pulled out my phone. If I was going to be exiled to the driveway, I might as well get some work done. 43 emails had landed since I left the office. I triaged the urgent ones legal needed my signature for the Singapore acquisition contract. Engineering wanted budget clearance on the new encryption module for Project Nexus. My assistant had already blocked out my schedule for tomorrow's rollout. Then a notification banner slid down. Marcus Reynolds, Blue Horizon's CEO and now technically my direct report. Running 15 late to Langston meeting. Traffic's a mess. Can you brief me quick? Sounds like the dad's difficult, but tech looks promising. My chest tightened. Langston. Difficult father. Promising tech. I read it twice. Then again, it couldn't be. I typed back Marcus just to confirm. Are you meeting with Gregory Langston of Langston Integrated Systems? His reply was nearly instant. Yes, small operation dated structure, but they've developed a protocol that might solve our government contract compliance bottleneck. My fingers trembled. Gregory Langston is my father. I'm currently sitting in his driveway. He told me to wait in the car during your meeting. He has no idea I'm Blue Horizon's new president. The 3 dots blinked, vanished, returned. Then finally, this is unexpected. Stay where you are. Arriving in 10. We'll handle this delicately. Marcus's message hung on my screen as I stared out through the windshield at the house I'd grown up in. The house that had once been filled with dinner table debates and the faint hum of soldering irons now sat still beneath the dusk. The universe really had a flair for irony. My father, Gregory Langston, the same man who once told me tech wasn't for women, was now actively courting investment from Blue Horizon Systems, the very company he mocked me for joining. And I, the daughter he dismissed, was now in a position to determine the future of his legacy. I watched the street in silence, letting the collision of past and present sink in. Part of me wanted to laugh. The rest of me couldn't quite believe it. Professionally, I had to remain objective. Langston Integrated Systems security prototype had legitimate potential. But personally, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing that I had built myself into the very person he swore I'd never become. Just then, a sleek black Tesla glided up the driveway. From it stepped Amanda Miller, Blue Horizon's CFO and my first mentor. She had spotted my potential long before anyone else and pushed for my promotion when others doubted my experience. Seeing her shoulders squared, posture strong, ignited something in me. I wasn't going to sit here like some castaway child waiting for approval. I was going to walk into that house as Harper Langston, president of Blue Horizon. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, reapplied my lipstick, and stepped out into the cool evening air. My heels clicked against the concrete as I followed Amanda toward the front door, timing my entrance perfectly behind the housekeeper who answered her knock. Gregory stood waiting in the foyer, that polished executive smile plastered on his face, the one that always looked more like armor than warmth. "Ms. Miller, welcome," he began. "We're honored to have you." He stopped mid-sentence when he caught sight of me behind her. His eyes flicked from recognition to disbelief to something colder. "Harper? I thought I asked you to?" "Harper." Amanda turned surprised. "I didn't realize this meeting involved your family." Gregory immediately stepped between us. "My daughter was just leaving, unfortunately. Prior commitment." He flashed me a glance sharp enough to cut glass. "Right, Harper." I stepped forward, offering Amanda my hand, keeping my tone even and professional. "Actually, there's been a misunderstanding. I wouldn't miss this dinner for anything." Amanda raised an eyebrow, clearly picking up on the tension but too seasoned to comment. Gregory's jaw clenched. He realized I wasn't going anywhere. "Well, come in then," he muttered, voice tight. We moved into the dining room, where Eleanor and Caleb were already seated beside a man I didn't recognize, probably one of the outside investors Marcus had invited. My mother's eyes widened as she saw me enter. Not in disapproval, but in shock. Maybe even something like hope. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small in that house. I felt ready. Caleb looked briefly confused, but offered a polite nod. The man beside him stood as Amanda and I approached, extending his hand with smooth confidence. "This is my daughter, Harper Gregory," said his tone dismissive. "She happened to be in town. And this is my son Caleb, who heads our development team." The emphasis on son and development team paired with the casual wave in my direction was so on brand, it nearly made me laugh. 2 decades had passed, and my father still wielded words like a scalpel, sharp, precise cutting. The stranger introduced himself as Richard Blackwood, a venture capitalist with Arcadia Partners. His handshake was firm, practiced, and his eyes flicked with curiosity when Amanda introduced me as Blue Horizon's president. Without further elaboration, we all took our seats. Gregory was visibly tense, his posture too straight, his hands too still. But to object to my presence now would have made things even more awkward, especially with Amanda and Richard seated beside me. My mother, Eleanor, floated in with a tray of appetizers, forcing a smile as she placed the dishes gently around the table. She retreated quickly as Gregory launched into a well-rehearsed monologue about Langston Integrated Systems' illustrious 20-year history. "We've consistently delivered secure, reliable hardware solutions," he said, sliding glossy brochures across the table. "While others have chased trends, we've stayed committed to quality." Caleb nodded occasionally, jumping in with supporting details, technical jargon and system specs, clearly rehearsed for this moment. Amanda listened politely while Richard flipped through the brochure. I remained quiet, scanning the room, watching the theater unfold. My father was doing what he always did, dressing stagnation in the language of principle. Refusal to evolve wasn't strategic, it was pride disguised. Our latest protocol, Gregory continued, offers a breakthrough in government-grade encryption. He gestured toward Caleb. Caleb, go ahead. Share the technical details with our guests. Caleb launched into an explanation about their architecture. Bits of it sounded eerily familiar. As he spoke, I realized they were using a framework I'd prototyped during my final year at UW. I'd tried to share those exact ideas once, and Gregory had dismissed them with a shrug. Amanda caught my eye and then asked Harper, "What are your thoughts on this approach? Do you think it aligns with where the industry is heading?" The room went still. Gregory's jaw tightened. Harper isn't involved in the technical side of our business. I set my water glass down slowly. Actually, the approach is solid, but not unique. At least 3 firms rolled out similar protocols over the last year and a half. The real differentiator would be seamless integration with adaptive cloud infrastructure. Caleb turned toward me, blinking. "You've been tracking this stuff." You could say that I replied, holding his gaze, not my father's. Amanda looked at me differently now. Richard looked intrigued. Amanda said carefully, "I wasn't aware you had a connection to the Langston family beyond our mention of the meeting." "Very familiar," I said with a quiet smile. "I grew up in this house." Just then, the doorbell rang. Gregory nearly leapt from his chair, grateful no doubt for the interruption. He mumbled an excuse and disappeared down the hall. That could only mean Marcus had arrived. Eleanor retreated to the kitchen again. Caleb leaned in, his voice lower now. "What are you doing?" Caleb whispered urgently, leaning toward me. "Dad's been working on this deal for months, just being honest about the technology," I said calmly. "Isn't that what investors deserve?" Amanda caught the exchange and raised an eyebrow, but stayed silent. Richard Blackwood, still leafing through the company brochures, seemed unaware, or maybe just unbothered by the tension thickening at the table. Footsteps echoed from the foyer. Gregory's booming voice floated in ahead of him. "We're delighted you could join us, Mr. Reynolds. I heard traffic was rough tonight." "Nothing too serious?" came Marcus's unmistakable voice. "Seattle likes to keep people guessing." A moment later, Gregory led Marcus into the dining room, projecting his usual bravado. Marcus's eyes swept the room, briefly landing on Amanda and Richard in polite acknowledgement. Then his gaze shifted, landing on me. His expression flickered just for a second. The widening of his eyes was subtle, but I caught it. He straightened his posture and, without missing a beat, inclined his head toward me. "Madam President," he said with respectful clarity, "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." The silence that followed was instant and heavy. Gregory stopped mid-stride beside Marcus. His expression twisted, confusion first, then disbelief, and finally something closer to horror. Eleanor, just returning from the kitchen with a casserole dish in her hands, froze. Her mouth parted, and for a moment I thought she might drop it. I think there's been a misunderstanding," Gregory stammered. "This is my daughter Harper." Marcus glanced between us, realization dawning. "Yes, Harper Langston, newly appointed president of Blue Horizon Systems." He turned to me with an apologetic half-smile. "I didn't connect Langston integrated with your name, though maybe I should have." All eyes snapped to me. Amanda's lips curled into the faintest smirk. Richard set down his drink, visibly intrigued. Caleb blinked at me like he was seeing someone entirely new. Gregory, meanwhile, looked like the floor had just dropped out from under him. "President." He echoed slowly, the title foreign on his tongue. I kept my expression neutral, though adrenaline was pounding in my chest. "The internal announcement went out last week," I said calmly. "The public press release is scheduled for Monday." Gregory sank into the nearest chair like someone had pulled the wind from his lungs. The man who had waved me off like a nuisance earlier now sat across from me, pale and shaken. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. For years, I had fought to be taken seriously in his world, his industry. And now, in his house at his dinner in front of his potential investors, my identity was no longer something he could minimize. Marcus, ever the professional, smoothly shifted back into discussion mode. I'd love to hear more about your protocol integration, but I imagine we'll be talking next steps directly with Harper. Another silence followed this one, laced with new understanding. I looked at my father and said, "Well, shall we continue? You're the president of Blue Horizon." Caleb asked, eyes wide. "Our competitor?" "Yes," I said, simply. In that moment, the memory of my college graduation came flooding back, my father's condescending laugh, the way he barely looked up from his phone when I told him I'd taken a job in tech. "They'll have you answering phones in 6 months," he'd said. And now, this. "Why didn't you tell us?" Eleanor asked softly, finally setting down the serving dish she'd been clutching like a lifeline. I kept my voice calm. Would it have mattered? It wasn't meant to be bitter, just honest. Dad made his opinions about my capabilities pretty clear a long time ago. Caleb leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. "So, you've been at Blue Horizon this whole time?" "Started in product development," I said. "Then project manager, then director of innovation, VP last year. And now president. It's been a busy 3 years." Marcus cleared his throat, shifting the focus to the stunned guests. "Harper has been instrumental in Blue Horizon's growth. Our market valuation has nearly tripled since she joined, largely because of the innovation she championed." Gregory's face was pale. I could practically hear his words from years ago echoing between us. "They're hiring you as a diversity prop." How confident he'd been. How wrong. Richard Blackwood, who had remained mostly silent until now, finally spoke up. His tone had shifted, measured, curious, and slightly amused. "Well," he said, setting down his wine glass, "this certainly changes the dynamics of our meeting." He turned to me, a new sharpness in his gaze. "I assume you're familiar with your father's proposal?" "Then?" "Actually, I'm not," I replied honestly. "I was only invited this afternoon. I didn't even know Blue Horizon was the potential investor until Marcus texted me from his car." "Fascinating," Richard murmured, eyes flicking between me and Gregory with the air of a man used to dissecting more than just business models. He read people. Eleanor, ever the bridge builder, stepped in, forcing a smile. "Why don't we all sit and enjoy dinner while we discuss next steps?" I made Gregory's favorite, beef Wellington. Amanda gave Marcus a quick glance before addressing Gregory directly. "Mr. Langston, given this unexpected development, I think it would be wise to reconsider how we approach tonight's discussion." Gregory seemed to collapse inward. The slick veneer he'd worn so tightly now cracked his words slower, less certain. "Yes, of course," he murmured, eyes not quite meeting anyone's. "Whatever you think is best." The shift was undeniable. The investors who had once arrived to hear Gregory pitch were now carefully watching me. I should have felt only vindicated. But there was something else, a pang of something more complicated. Sadness, maybe, at how long it had taken, at how much had been wasted in proving a point that shouldn't have needed proving. Still, the truth remained, the power dynamic had flipped. And this time, I wasn't backing down. The daughter once told to wait in the car was now unmistakably in control of the meeting. Marcus, ever composed and diplomatic, gently steered the conversation forward. "I think we should proceed with dinner and our planned discussion," he said smoothly. "The technology itself deserves evaluation on its own merits, regardless of any personal connections." He looked toward me for agreement. "Absolutely," I said, matching his tone. "We're all professionals here." As Eleanor began serving dinner, the table settled into an uneasy rhythm. But the shift in dynamic was undeniable. Questions that had once been directed solely to Gregory were now aimed squarely at me. Richard asked for my take on emerging encryption trends and cloud compliance regulation. Amanda inquired about integration possibilities with our proprietary architecture. Even Caleb, who'd spent years in lockstep with our father, began explaining technical details to me rather than deferring to Gregory. Throughout it all, my father sat quietly watching, not interrupting, not correcting, just observing. I caught him studying me several times, his expression unreadable, like he was trying to reconcile the version of me in his head with a woman now fielding complex business questions with confidence and fluency. When dessert arrived, Eleanor tried to gently shift the mood. "Harper," she said with a hopeful smile, "tell us about your new apartment. Are you still in Belltown?" "Actually, I moved to the Seaport District," I replied, taking a small bite of the rich, dark chocolate tart she'd made. "Closer to the office? It's a corner unit with a harbor view," Marcus added casually, then smirked. "Though she's rarely in it, she practically lives in the development lab or with our clients." Gregory, finally breaking his silence, set down his fork. "So you're leading the technical side, too?" he asked, as if trying to catch up with a reality he never imagined. The question stung, not because it was cruel, but because it revealed how little he had ever tried to understand what I actually did. "I hold 7 patents with Blue Horizon," I said plainly. "I lead the innovation division alongside my executive duties." He nodded slowly, processing, swallowing pride. The man who once told me tech wasn't for women was now staring down a resume filled with undeniable proof. He looked at me across the table and said almost inaudibly, "I had no idea." It wasn't quite an apology, but from Gregory Langston, it was the closest I might ever get. As coffee was poured, the conversation circled back to its original purpose: Langston integrated systems, security protocol, and the potential for investment from Blue Horizon. Only now, there was no question about who held the power at the table. "Let's discuss the specifics," I said, holding my father's gaze. "What exactly are you hoping for from Blue Horizon?" The dining room took on the air of a boardroom. Gregory shifted in his seat, hesitating before answering. "We're seeking a strategic investment of $3 million, he said, voice tight, sliding a folder toward me, not Marcus. The deference was subtle, but it was there. If you've ever had to prove your worth to the very people who doubted you, this story is far from over. Don't miss what happens when the balance of power finally shifts. Subscribe to the channel so you're here when the next chapter unfolds. With proper funding, we believe we can capture 15% of the government security market within 18 months. Gregory said, sliding the proposal folder toward me. I flipped it open, scanning the projections quickly. The formatting was clean, but the numbers far too optimistic. These market penetration estimates seem aggressive. I noted evenly, tapping a chart with my finger, especially given the presence of established players. I glanced up. "What's your differentiation strategy compared to CyberShield's protocol?" "They launched something similar just last quarter." Gregory blinked. "CyberShield has a comparable product." Before the awkward pause stretched too long, Caleb jumped in. "They do. It uses a different encryption method, but Harper's right, the overlap is significant. We believe our implementation is more efficient." Caleb continued, warming to the topic, especially against quantum-based attacks. "CyberShield hasn't addressed that vulnerability in their current release." I nodded, impressed. "That's a strong angle, though. The quantum threat timeline is still mostly theoretical. Can you walk me through the architecture?" Without hesitation, Caleb stood and opened his notebook, sketching out the core design. His explanation was clear, thoughtful, grounded in real-world application. I pressed deeper with questions about scalability, deployment environments, and integration capabilities. These were the concerns our government partners would raise. I wanted to hear how prepared he was. After several exchanges, I sat back. "The encryption engine is solid," I said, tapping his diagram. "But your deployment model is outdated." Gregory's brow furrowed. "Our clients value physical security. Cloud solutions introduce vulnerabilities." "That was true 5 years ago," I replied. "But today, zero-trust architectures and secure segmentation have shifted the landscape. Even the Pentagon has migrated over 80% of its non-classified operations to the cloud." Amanda nodded in agreement. "She's right. The market has already moved." Gregory glanced at Caleb for backup. But this time, my brother hesitated. Then sighed. "She's right, Dad. I've tried to raise this before. You've been convinced clients wouldn't accept cloud integration, but the industry has changed." The tension in Gregory's jaw was unmistakable. Being challenged by both of his children in front of investors was clearly not part of his plan. I could have pushed harder. I could have dissected every outdated decision he made. But I didn't. That wasn't the purpose of the meeting. So instead, I shifted the conversation forward. The encryption method Caleb outlined has value, I said. With the right modifications, it could complement our existing government solutions portfolio. Marcus, who had been quietly taking notes, finally spoke. What kind of modifications we'd need to restructure the entire deployment architecture, I answered. Align it with our cloud-based security framework and run updated threat modeling. Essentially, we'd preserve the core encryption engine and rebuild the rest. Gregory's expression darkened. So he said slowly, "You'd strip away everything, except the one piece my son developed." Gregory's comment said more than he likely meant to. It was an admission, perhaps unconscious, that the most valuable part of their system had come not from him, but from Caleb. I'm evaluating this like any other potential acquisition, I said evenly, identifying which components strengthen our existing ecosystem and which don't. Across the table, Richard Blackwood leaned forward for the first time in a while. His gaze was sharp, analytical. "If I may," he said, voice calm but deliberate, "this feels less like a classic investment opportunity and more like an acquisition target. The encryption protocol certainly has value, but the broader business infrastructure doesn't appear positioned to compete on its own." Gregory's face flushed instantly. "Langston Integrated Systems has been independent for over 2 decades, he said stiffly. "We're not looking to be absorbed." Dad Caleb said gently, "We need to be realistic. We've lost market share every quarter for the past 3 years. He glanced down then back up. "The protocol is strong, but we don't have the resources to scale it." It was the first time I'd heard just how bad things had gotten. The worried glance Eleanor gave Gregory only confirmed it. "What's your current runway?" I asked, sliding into full evaluation mode. Gregory hesitated, then finally answered. 4 months, maybe 5, at our current burn rate. The room fell quiet. No one looked surprised except maybe me. No wonder Eleanor had pleaded with me to come. This wasn't just about growth. It was about survival. I took a deep breath and straightened in my chair. "There are 3 viable paths forward," I said, measuring each word. First, a limited investment targeted funding to commercialize the encryption protocol as a standalone offering. Gregory's brow furrowed. Second, I continued a full acquisition. Blue Horizon would acquire the intellectual property and retain key technical staff to continue development under our umbrella. And the third, Gregory asked tightly, already bracing for the answer, a structured wind down. We license the technology and provide transition packages for team members. That ensures value retention without sustaining ongoing losses. My tone remained clinical professional, but the weight of what I was saying struck hard. Gregory's posture slumped his fingers, tightening around the edge of the table. This was the man who once dismissed me as incapable of understanding tech. The man who sent me to the car like a child. And now he sat silently while I outlined the possible end of the company he built. Is there no version of this where Langston Integrated continues, as he asked, quietly, the fight draining from his voice? I met his eyes. "Not based on what I've seen tonight," I said. "The market's shifted. Your current model can't compete long-term. But your technology, particularly the encryption engine, has potential. That part can move forward." Silence settled around us again. Marcus and Amanda exchanged a brief glance, both visibly impressed by my objectivity. Richard studied Gregory like a man watching the final chapter of a business case study. For the first time that evening, I realized I wasn't just evaluating a company. I was writing its legacy. Caleb surprised me by speaking up. "I think we need to consider the acquisition option seriously." "Dad," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "It would preserve what we've built and finally give us the resources to implement it properly." Gregory's hands clenched on the edge of the table. For a moment, I braced for the explosion. The Gregory Langston I remembered, volatile and proud, would have already erupted, but instead his voice came out controlled. Tense, but not angry. "And what happens to our team?" he asked. "People who've been loyal to us for years through every setback? It was the first time I'd heard concern in his voice that wasn't self-protective. Not about his reputation or his authority, but about his people. For a moment, I wondered if I'd misjudged him in some ways. Maybe not entirely, but enough. In an acquisition, I explained gently we'd evaluate each role against our current structure. The technical team, especially those working on the encryption protocol, would likely transition. I hesitated. Other roles that overlap with our existing departments would be offered competitive severance packages. We'd handle it with care. Gregory looked up, his gaze steady. "And me?" he asked. The room stilled. Amanda set her wine glass down. Richard leaned back, watchful. Caleb exhaled slowly. The question hung there, raw, unfiltered. A father asking his daughter about the fate of his own career. "That depends on what you want, Dad," I said carefully. "If you'd like to stay involved, we can discuss an advisory role, something transitional. If you're ready to step back, we'd ensure a respectful exit. With full acknowledgement of what you built." Gregory nodded. Once slowly, the words seemed to land. He didn't bristle, didn't argue. After a long silence, he looked from Richard to Amanda, then to Caleb, and finally to me. "I need to make a call," he said quietly, rising from his chair. "Please excuse me for a moment." He left the room without another word. I stayed frozen for a beat, unsure whether to continue the business discussion or follow. There was still so much unsaid between us, and something in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged, ever so slightly pulled at me. Marcus read my hesitation. "Take 10, he murmured. "We'll go over specs with Caleb." I nodded, then stepped away from the table. I found Gregory on the back porch, standing alone, looking out at the garden Eleanor had cultivated for decades. The porch light cast long shadows over the grass, and the motion sensor above the stairs clicked softly as it activated. He didn't turn when he heard my footsteps, just stared out, hands on the railing. "I always assumed Caleb would take over the company," he said to the dark. "Never imagined I'd be standing here talking to my daughter about its end." I moved beside him. "It doesn't have to be the end," I said quietly. "The technology can survive. It can evolve. That's what innovation does." He said nothing, but he didn't walk away either. Gregory finally turned to face me. "Like you evolved beyond what I thought possible." The words weren't angry, just layered thick with years of unspoken tension, surprise, and a quiet grief neither of us had ever named. "I should never have told you to wait in the car when Marcus arrived," he added before I could respond. That was inappropriate. Coming from Gregory Langston, that kind of statement was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard. I met it with a small nod, letting it land without needing to fill the silence. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "About your promotions, your success. Your mother would have been so proud." I held his gaze. "Would you have been proud?" I asked quietly. "Or would you have found some way to downplay it, like you always did?" He flinched, not dramatically, but enough to show it landed. Was I really that bad? Instead of answering, I asked, "Do you remember my 17th birthday?" He frowned, digging through old memories. "I showed you the predictive text algorithm I'd built," I said. "Way before it became standard on phones. I'd spent months teaching myself Python and Java just to make it work." He was still searching his mind. "You looked at it for 30 seconds, I continued, said, 'That's nice, honey,' and then spent the rest of the evening helping Caleb debug his college-level AI simulator. The memory still burned even now. That was the pattern, Dad. My work was nice. Caleb's. That was genius." Something shifted in his expression. A slow dawning regret. Recognition, maybe even guilt. "I didn't see it," he said finally. "How differently I treated you." "You told me tech wasn't for women," I reminded him gently. "You didn't just discourage me, you tried to reroute me away from the thing I loved most." He ran a hand down his face, exhaling deeply. "I was wrong. Spectacularly wrong." He motioned vaguely toward the warm lights and voices filtering from the dining room. "The president of Blue Horizon," he said softly, still shaking his head. "My daughter. There was pride in his voice now, the kind I had never heard directed at me before. And despite everything, it still mattered. Some part of me, a younger version who'd waited years for that moment, felt the warmth spread quietly through my chest. "I didn't do this to prove you wrong," I said. "I just couldn't be anyone else." He nodded slowly. "I wish I'd known who you really were," he admitted. "I was so set on who I thought you should be, I never saw what you could be." The back door creaked open, spilling light across the porch. Eleanor stepped out, her apron now folded over one arm. Her gaze moved between us, cautious but hopeful. "Everything okay out here?" she asked softly. "We're talking, Mom?" I said, turning toward her. Really talking for the first time. She stepped to Gregory's side, her hand finding his instinctively. And for once, he didn't pull away. "Your father called me last week," Eleanor said gently, her hand still resting on his arm after he heard Blue Horizon might be interested in the company. She glanced at me with a knowing smile. "He was excited about the possibility of working with you even before he knew you were in leadership. He said, maybe this could be a way to repair things." I turned toward Gregory, startled. "Is that true?" He shifted uncomfortably, then nodded. "I may have followed your career more than you realized," he admitted. "Not the president part that stunned me, but I knew you were doing well. I checked press releases, browsed trade journals. Quietly, I guess." He looked down at the porch floor. "I thought if our companies had a connection, maybe it would give us a reason to reconnect. I should have been bigger than my pride. I should have called you directly, Harper. Not tried to orchestrate this business pretense." The words caught me off guard. For 3 years, I'd assumed he'd written me off completely, that I'd become invisible in his eyes. But in his own clumsy way, he'd been watching, maybe even rooting for me from the sidelines. Before I could respond, the back door creaked again. Caleb stepped outside, his expression an awkward mix of concern and curiosity. "Everyone's wondering if we're still having a meeting," he said lightly, "or if this turned into a family therapy session." It was a weak joke, but a well-timed one. "We're coming back in," Gregory said, straightening a bit. Then he surprised us both by turning to Caleb and asking, "What do you think about the acquisition option?" Caleb blinked clearly, startled to be asked so directly. He looked from Dad to me, then answered thoughtfully. "I think Harper's right," he said. "Our tech deserves a chance to scale, and Blue Horizon can make that happen. The name over the door doesn't matter nearly as much as what we've built." Gregory nodded slowly, accepting his son's input without argument. "And what about you?" he asked. "Would you want to join Blue Horizon if this goes forward?" Caleb glanced toward me. "Would there be a place for me?" "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. "Your encryption engine is brilliant. Any company would be lucky to have you on their team, including mine." Caleb smiled genuinely. For the first time in years, it wasn't guarded or strained. "That would be interesting. Working together again?" Gregory adjusted his blazer, a glimmer of the executive returning to his posture. "Well," he said, lifting his chin, "shall we go back in and discuss the details? Like professionals, I find myself open to options I wouldn't have considered an hour ago." As we moved toward the door, he paused and looked at me directly. "Harper," he said quietly, "I was wrong about you, about so many things. I'm sorry it took this dramatic turn for me to see it." Coming from Gregory Langston, those words were monumental. I felt the lump in my throat tighten. "Better late than never," Dad, I said softly. "Let's go see what we can build together." 3 months later, I stood in the doorway of my childhood home with a bottle of champagne in hand. The quarterly family dinner had become our new tradition, and for the first time, it was one I actually looked forward to. "There she is," my mother called from the kitchen, emerging in a flour-dusted apron that read, "World's Best Mom," a birthday gift I'd given her years ago. Right on time. I stepped inside, brushing the drizzle from my coat sleeve. The scent of rosemary chicken and something sweet drifted through the air. Gregory appeared from his study reading glasses, perched low on his nose, a tablet in hand. If anything, he looked younger than he had a few months ago, standing taller, moving with renewed purpose. "Harper," he said, tapping the screen. "I was just reviewing the latest integration metrics. Remarkable progress. The acquisition had gone through smoothly. Langston Integrated Systems was now Blue Horizon Government Security Division, with Caleb leading the technical team and Gregory staying on as a strategic advisor. The encryption protocol integrated with our cloud architecture had already secured 2 major federal contracts. The Pentagon meeting went well, Eleanor asked, taking the champagne from my hands and ushering me toward the living room. Better than expected, I replied, smiling. They've committed to implementing our protocol across all non-classified systems by next quarter. I slipped off my jacket and settled into the familiar sofa, the same one I'd once collapsed into after college exams, breakups, and family tensions. Caleb was brilliant in the demo, I added. He's always been good with the technicals, Gregory said, setting down his tablet. But he needed your vision to see the bigger picture. He looked at me warmly. You complement each other well. Praise like that would have been unthinkable 4 months ago. The man who once told me tech wasn't for women now regularly consulted me on high-level strategy and made sure everyone in his orbit knew exactly what his daughter had accomplished. The doorbell rang, and Eleanor hurried to answer. Caleb entered moments later with his girlfriend Emma, both laughing as they carried a bakery box from the cafe near our office. Sorry we're late, Caleb said, placing the dessert on the counter. Team meeting ran long, but we've solved the latency issue with the protocol, Gregory beamed. That's wonderful news. He clapped Caleb on the back, then turned to me. Both my children revolutionizing cybersecurity. Who would have thought some of us saw the potential earlier than others? Eleanor teased, flashing him a look that was more playful than pointed. Gregory chuckled. The greatest mistake of my career, he said, raising his glass of sparkling cider, was underestimating my daughter. Thank goodness she didn't listen to me. We moved to the dining table, the same one where our confrontation had erupted months earlier. But now the energy was different. My father, once the sole voice of authority, now regularly deferred to my input. Caleb and I collaborated with ease. And my mother. She no longer hovered quietly at the edges. Her voice carried in the room. As we passed dishes and swapped updates, I realized something profound. This wasn't just a family dinner. It was a celebration of change, of growth, of finally seeing one another clearly and choosing to move forward together. Caleb and I had finally developed the kind of sibling relationship we should have always had, built on mutual respect, collaboration, and an unspoken understanding of how far we'd both come. I invited Marcus and Amanda for next month's dinner, Gregory mentioned, as we passed around dishes. They've been instrumental in making this transition work. Amanda told me she always knew you'd run the company someday, Eleanor added with a smile. She said she saw it during your first week. I couldn't help but smile at the memory. Amanda had taken a quiet interest in me when no one else did, mentoring me behind the scenes, giving me responsibility when others only saw risk. She believed in me. Before I fully believed in myself, I said. Gregory looked down, then back up at me. That's what we should have done, he said quietly. Believed in who you actually were, not who we assumed you should be. It wasn't all bad, Dad, I replied gently. Your expectations taught me grit. If everything had been easy, maybe I wouldn't have developed the resilience I needed. He considered that for a moment, then shook his head slowly. That's generous of you, he said. But let's not rewrite history. I was wrong, plain and simple. His humility still caught me off guard. The man who had once ruled the dining room with absolute certainty now sat beside me with open vulnerability. The business setbacks had shaken something deep in him, but in that brokenness, something else had emerged. Something stronger. As we settled into dessert, Caleb raised his glass. To second chances, he said warmly, and to Harper, who had every right to walk away but chose reconciliation instead. To honesty, I added, lifting my own glass. Without that dinner months ago, we might still be living behind polite fictions instead of building something real. Gregory nodded thoughtfully. The greatest lesson I've learned through all this, he said, is that success isn't about control. It's about recognizing potential in all its forms and having the wisdom to nurture it rather than force it into a mold. Eleanor, never one to miss an opening, leaned in. Speaking of potential, your cousin Stephanie called this morning. I raised an eyebrow. Stephanie? Her daughter's interested in computer science, she said. But she's feeling discouraged. Her male classmates keep questioning her ideas. I thought, maybe you could talk to her. Absolutely, I said without hesitation. I remember what that felt like. And Right Horizon. That's what the team's been calling our new division could offer her an internship. Caleb added, referring to the nickname affectionately adopted by the staff. Start building the pipeline early. Gregory beamed the pride on his face unmistakable. And this time, it stretched equally across both of us. Who knows? He said, looking toward Eleanor with a grin. Maybe she'll be running the company after Harper. The comment made without hesitation or condescension reflected just how far he'd come. And in that moment, I realized how far we had come, not just as colleagues or even family, but as people learning, growing, and finally, seeing one another clearly. The man who once told me technology wasn't for women was now talking passionately about empowering the next generation of female engineers. As dinner wrapped up and we carried our coffee into the living room, I found myself pausing to take it all in. The hardwood floors, the scent of cinnamon from Eleanor's apple, tart, the steady hum of family conversation, it was all familiar. And yet, everything had changed. The hurt young woman who once stormed out of this house, determined to prove her father wrong, had returned not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a woman secure in her identity, a leader, a builder. Someone strong enough to accept reconciliation without sacrificing anything she'd earned. I've been thinking, Gregory said, settling into his favorite leather armchair, about starting a foundation, something focused on girls in STEM, using some of the acquisition proceeds to fund scholarships, mentorship programs, real impact work. I blinked. That was not something the Gregory Langston of 5 years ago would have ever imagined, let alone said out loud. That's a wonderful idea, I said. Blue Horizon would absolutely match funding. We've been looking to expand our outreach programs. He nodded thoughtfully, then added, I'd like to name it after you if you're comfortable with that. The Harper Langston Foundation for Innovation. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The gesture hit deeper than I expected. I felt tears rise and didn't bother blinking them away. I'd be honored, I said, voice tight with emotion. Gregory cleared his throat. It's time I backed up my changed perspective with real action. Words mean nothing without follow-through. I smiled. I agree, and I think this could help more young women than we'll ever know. As the evening came to a close and coats were retrieved, Gregory touched my arm and asked for a moment alone. In the quiet hallway, away from the clatter of dishes and low hum of voices, he looked at me with an intensity I hadn't seen in years. I want you to know, he said slowly, that even though I came to it too late, I couldn't be prouder of the woman and the leader you've become. My breath caught. And not because you proved me wrong or built something remarkable, he continued, but because you stayed true to yourself, even when I gave you every reason not to. I hugged him, then really hugged him for the first time in years. No awkward pat on the back, no half-hearted embrace. Just something real. Thank you, I whispered, for changing, for owning your part. He chuckled softly. When your CEO bows to your daughter in your own living room, only a fool would keep denying reality. That night, driving back through the quiet streets of Seattle, I reflected on everything we'd been through. Sometimes growth only comes after painful confrontation. Sometimes patterns can change if someone is brave enough to break them. And sometimes the approval we once thought we needed turns out to matter less than the belief we find in ourselves. The girl once told to wait in the car had become the woman leading the way. Not for revenge, but because success speaks loudest when it's rooted in truth. And I had nothing left to prove. If this story resonated with you, even a little, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know, have you ever had to prove your worth to someone who doubted you? Or better yet, have you ever found the courage to be yourself in a space that tried to tell you who to be? I can't tell you how much it would mean to me to hear your stories. I didn't expect to share this part of my life, but now that it's out there, I'm hoping it inspires someone else to stop waiting in the car and start walking into the room like they belong. Because you do. And if you believe in second chances, quiet strength, and the power of transformation, I hope you'll subscribe and stay with me. There's more to come. Here's what I've learned. It's okay if not everyone sees your potential right away. What matters most is that you see it even if it starts as just a flicker. The people who try to define you aren't always cruel. Sometimes they're just limited by their own beliefs. But your job isn't to carry their limitations, it's to outgrow them. Stay focused, stay grounded, and let your results speak. Be kind even when you're underestimated. Stand firm even when you're dismissed. And when your moment comes when someone who once looked past you finally sees you, don't let bitterness rob you of your grace. Accept the apology, accept the growth, and then move forward, not for revenge, but for the person you've become. That's what real power looks like. And trust me, you already have it. You just have to believe it enough to use it.